Good afternoon. We're going to move the conversation to the practice of philanthropy. And so I ask that you all take your seats so that we can start. I'm not good at this. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to quickly announce for everyone, I think that most of you are aware of the bomb blasts in Boston. So I will ask you to, if you want to continue your conversations, to perhaps move those conversations, particularly at the reserve tables up front. Okay, thanks. We can hear ourselves. So I think that most of you are probably aware of the bomb blasts that occurred, or apparent bomb blast that occurred in Boston today at the Boston Marathon. And I just wanted to say on behalf of all of us that our hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to all those affected, and to let you know that there have been 2 confirmed dead and many others injured. Google has set up a mechanism for learning about locating any loved ones, any friends or family that are in Boston, and so we're going to make sure that we put up on the screen the way in which to access that information. And if you through GPF Connect, and if you find you need any help, feel free to turn to any member of the staff. Just grab them, and they'll help you out in that regard. But in the meantime, this is a sad moment indeed for us all. We have heard a lot today about the ways in which digital data can be used to enhance governance, to allow countries to set priorities and to improve and continuously improve and improve the design and the delivery of any government services. And we've had a bit of a conversation about the ways in which data can be used by grantors and grantees as they're trying to figure out how to be their most, to ensure that their interventions are specific and relevant and effective, and in very complex situations, such as the issues of slavery, the issues of hunger, and other issues that we'll be covering, and of course human trafficking. Before we turn to our working group sessions and start rolling up our sleeves and trying to tackle these various issues, I thought we would just turn for a moment to the question of the practice of philanthropy and the way in which the new tools that are at our disposal might be actually changing and improving that practice. And so joining in that conversation is Larry Kramer. Larry has been president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation since last September. He's a constitutional scholar. Before that, he was dean at the Stanford School of Law. And we're so pleased that we've been able to capture him from that world into the world of philanthropy. We'll find out if he is as pleased. Brad Smith. You all know Brad is the president of the Foundation Center, which is one of the major data aggregators when it comes to the sector. Before joining the Foundation Center, he headed the Oak Foundation in Geneva, and before that, he was at the Ford Foundation, both in New York and in Brazil. So Larry, I'm going to start with you. We've heard all this about how data can be used to improve decision-making, and we have more evidence now than we've ever had in any given issue that we might choose. But I just want to know, is that how human beings actually make decisions?
Well, I suppose it depends on which human beings. So, my sense of it is, and I think this is not new to experience in the foundation world, but just, decision-making in any context is yes and no, which is to say, you of course need and want data, and then the struggle is to make sure that you control the way you use it rather than the reverse. So, depends on the question, and it depends on what the data is. I love the title of this session, right, an art or a science, because of course the answer is both. But my own intuitions are it's art informed by science, and the risks with data and the risks that I think I've already begun to experience some are the data can become a limiting factor. It can become something that changes the kinds of things that you venture upon, and that to me is right. So you tend to begin to think more short term. You tend to shy away from certain kinds of questions. You tend to shy away from certain kinds of risks because you're not confident enough in the data. So you need to find a way to balance those kinds of considerations.
Right, and we always think of risk as being, in effect, that the philanthropic sector is unique in its capacity to take risks, and that is a large part of its value to society. Are you already seeing signs of that, of a shying away, or you're just fearful of it?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't have long enough experience to know whether it's a shying away. I will say honestly that it's not a very risky. My own intuition is we don't live up to our billing.
We don't have a big risk appetite.
It's a very risk-averse sector from my perspective, from what I've seen so far.
And how might that change?
Well, I think data, the focus on data, if anything, exacerbates that still more. It makes you more nervous because it'll be so, about venturing in and especially about taking long-term gambles. And so that's something that I think, it's really important to focus on and pay attention to and not let that happen.
You make me think about how expectations might change on the part of the public when it comes to transparency and the pervasive use of social media and access to digital data. It makes us come to sort of expect an extraordinary level of transparency. And I'm wondering if there is any danger that. Well, let me just sort of step back for a minute and say we expect that when it comes to the public sector with democratic governments, that we should have a high degree of transparency, and we expect that with a publicly held company.
Right.
But we don't expect that with a private philanthropy. Do you expect that to change?
I hope so. We've already under Paul, I think Hewlett was actually quite focused on being transparent, but we're re-examining that now in order to see whether there's farther we can go. So again, at the end of the day, it's just you make decisions about what you're going to do, and you just have to be prepared to explain them. And as long as you do that, I think it's incredibly important to be fully transparent about everything you do. One of the interesting things I think we're as subject to this as most. It's really hard to know exactly why we're doing what we're doing. So we spend a lot of time with potential grantees who haven't been able to actually figure out exactly what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it, which is, we end up wasting a lot of their time, we end up wasting a lot of our own time. And so, fully exposing both why you're doing what you're doing, exactly what you're doing, what you're learning, how far you're going, I think is really pivotal. And then you just have to be prepared where it's not working out as well as you might ideally want, to explain that. The hardest thing, and I would be curious to get other people's reactions to this, is figuring out, what is our expected failure rate, right? So in the venture world, if you're lucky, maybe 1 out of 10 things works out, and people in that business are comfortable with that. Of course, the 1 out of 10 that works out really big, hopefully, and how to think about that in our context is different. So that's where when my sense that it's actually a pretty risk-averse sector comes from the fact that I think actually people are very intolerant of risk. They do not want to fail. And so all of the issues, whether it's about transparency or risk-taking, are really driven by that as much as anything else. And as I say, you need a sort of sense of how often are we prepared to say, we tried that, it didn't work, let's try something else. There's no really good benchmarks or even much of a conversation about it.
Brad, can you think of examples or offer us up some examples where a foundation has stepped forward and said, we really got this wrong and this is why, and where that's proved really helpful to the field more broadly?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to give examples because there's so few. Actually, the Irvine Foundation, this is quite some time ago, sort of publicly did a study of a failed education initiative. And what's interesting is that today people are still talking about this as this great admission of failure by a foundation. And I think it stands out and it's remembered because it's one of the rare ones. The Gates Foundation has also done it, I think, on school size. But it is quite rare. And the fact that the few examples make such a big impact tells us a lot.
Yeah. Now, I know that the Hewlett Foundation has joined with Gates and Knight and Mott and others in looking at the question of how to build kind of a knowledge commons. I mean, it's not just examples of failures, but it's really all the learnings. And, you know, when you think about the world you're from academe, you know, whatever the field is, you not only you do your research, you subject it to peer review, and you disseminate the knowledge, right? And that's sort of an understood part of it. And if you're really unlucky, they then make you dean, right? So that's how it works. But
I have a few unpublished manuscripts of things that didn't quite work out.
But you know, how would we go about building such a knowledge commons in the field of philanthropy?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of problems, right? So apart from willingness, because I do think there's, you know, a fair amount of willingness, the vocabulary problems are huge. So figuring out what you're talking about and whether you're talking about the same things as other people can be difficult. You know, one of the other things that has surprised me a little, again, I'm obviously relatively new to this, is as dean of the law school, I hated the competition part. I really did. It was just no fun. I didn't actually care what was going on at Harvard or Yale Law School, but I had to. So one of the things that attracted me to this sector was that it was non-competitive. I'm not competing with any of the other foundations. We're actually just trying to figure out ways to do work together. And yet somehow it seems harder to get cooperation in this sector than it was there. I did better, you know, finding ways to work with Elena Kagan at Harvard than I have done, you know, I won't mention any names because it's not particular. It does seem to be kind of sector-wide, and a lot of it comes from vocabulary. A lot of it comes from the complexity of the internal structures. So you've got, you know, so many levels involved in making decisions, and people with different knowledge levels. So I, as CEO, I'm not necessarily going to override my program directors or program officers unless I either know better than them, which is not true in most of the things that we're working in, or feel really, really strongly about something. And so that makes it a little difficult when you've got to sort of persuade people at 3 or 4 levels. And then, of course, there's the whole board level, although, you know, boards are, as much as anything, I think, an excuse, right? I can't do that because my board will never go for it. And so in the academy, we used to use spouses that way. I would love to come to your school, but my wife, she just will not move. And so I think that all makes it quite difficult to actually, you know, to get people to take the preliminary steps that you need. Once you get past that, you know, I think then dealing with the level of how much do we want to expose our own failures, but also, and this is a really hard question, you know, we support organizations. So it's one thing for me to make public the ways in which I failed. It's another way for me to make public the ways in which we may have decided that some organization failed, which will hurt them. Right? So we're not going to fund organization X anymore for whatever reasons there are. And that's a trickier question, right? And I'm also not completely comfortable just putting that out there because of the effects that it can have, which may or may not be fair. And so that makes it difficult as well.
So if your board or your wife fail you on this question, you can turn to consultancies. That's what they're for too. It's like, we hired a management consultant and they said no. So, I mean, let's move to the practicalities of it, Brad. And first, I love this comment on having the same language. I remember when I went from the State Department to Carnegie, I wrote up a grant to Carnegie Corporation, and it was a grant to a grantee in India, and I referred to them as in South Asia, and the corporate secretary came back to me and said, India is not in South Asia. India is on the Indian subcontinent. And I said, gee, at the State Department, they're in South Asia. And at that moment, I realized that Carnegie was a lot more important in my life than the State Department. So it's the subcontinent. But talk to us about this notion of shared, first place of how do we think about what data should be shared and what shouldn't, but second, the practicalities of things like language.
Yeah, I think there's basically 3 sort of classes of data that are useful for philanthropy. The first is transactional data about actually the grants that foundations give. What are the grants they give, who they give them to, who are the partners, and what are they for? I would describe that as transactional data, sort of following the money. I think the second class of data is contextual data. The data from other sources that would help you make good strategic, good programmatic decisions. It could be crop yield, It could be infrastructure, it could be demographic information, it could be climatic information, whatever is useful to make the decisions for the particular problem you're seeking to address. And then I think the third is probably the most elusive and the most complicated, which is impact and effectiveness data. And I think you get all those from different sources. The Foundation Center covers a lot of the transactional data, actually sort of following the money from foundations to their partners. Organizations like GuideStar have a lot of information on the effectiveness and impact data. Then, of course, the contextual data comes from all over the place. It comes from the World Bank, come from the UNDP, come from census data, from lots of different places. Now, the sector itself, and I'd like to sort of take issue with something that Larry said about having data can actually lead to you being risk adverse, because I think there's ways in which data can also be liberating and give people courage. And if we look at the philanthropy as an industry, let's just take it in the US for a minute. It's an industry with close to $700 billion in assets. It's an industry with over 80,000 independent foundations. And it's an industry which gives out close to $50 billion a year. Now, when you say foundations, it's probably the most dangerous word you can use, because there's lots of different kinds of institutions included within the name foundation. There's less than 900 foundations have assets of over $100 million. So a lot of times when we're talking about staff and boards, and the board saying one thing and the staff saying another, we're talking about a subset of those foundations that have a lot of the money, but a relatively small number of the foundations. At the other end, there's 75% of foundations have only 4 staff or less. And that's a very different institution than the Hewlett Foundation or a Gates Foundation. But the common vocabulary is really the key to building the bridge. And I'll just give one example of how I think finding that vocabulary can actually encourage people to take risks. We did a project with the International Human Rights Funders Group. It's an affinity group of about 200 foundations around the world that fund human rights. This is some of the toughest work you can be involved in. It's politically sensitive. It makes enemies. It's risky. And a lot of foundations are scared to do it. What we had to do with them is sit down with their members and say, okay, what is human rights for the purpose of philanthropy? That actually took 2 years to figure out. It took 8 rounds of going back and forth to develop what is called a data architecture for human rights. For example, freedom from violence is a basic human right. But within that fits anti-trafficking and slavery we heard about today, gender violence, domestic violence, degrading treatment and torture, different kinds of violations within that category of human rights. Once we built that out, we applied it to the entire database that we have, which includes all US foundations and a growing number of non-US foundations. Now remember, I said the International Human Rights Funders Group has 200 members. When we ran this against the whole database, we found over 3,000 foundations around the world that were funding some aspect of human rights. Now most of those foundations don't have what they call a human rights program. But human rights funders are like almost any kind of funder. They sort of live within their own terminology and their own labels. And the light that went on in their heads when we showed this to them was that there's a vast number of foundations and a sea of resources out there they could be collaborating with, they could be leveraging, that don't necessarily use the same language to describe what they do, but maybe working on violence against women, maybe working on trafficking and slavery. I remember when Larry came to visit when he was in the first few months of the job, I was showing him a GIS mapping application of this data, and I said, Hewlett's in there, and even though you don't have a human rights program, and he looked at it and said, oh yeah, that's our access to education work. So I think in cases like that, the data can actually be liberating because funders like to know that they're not alone on an issue, particularly a complicated, complex, and controversial issue.
Is there something that can be learned, or actually the answer is yes. So what can be learned by philanthropists who are present, who are in emerging economies? They're setting up their foundations now. They don't have to deal with having the language wrong. Yeah. They can set it up in such a way that they can capture all that you're capturing. Yeah,
well, I think the first thing is that's really important, and it sounds kind of strange, but that there's no obligation to be unique. And there's something about the nature of philanthropy that we tend to set up unique institutions. And part of being a unique institution is you tend to create your own labels for your programs and your own information system. So the second thing is, don't necessarily create your own custom grants management system. And look around the world. When you've decided what issues you're going to work on, look around the world at how information is structured among other organizations, be they government, intergovernment, business, or whatever, that are working on or other foundations on a similar set of issues. And there are databases out there that you can access. I mean, there's foundation center databases, there's lots of databases out there. But I think this not trying to be unique and sort of looking before you leap at how information's organized in other sectors. We've done some work in the water sector, and the water sector is an area in which government is the big spender. So if you're going to be a foundation that's going to work on access to safe water, it's probably worth looking at the OECD DAC coding system, which is a public system. You can go on their website and get it, to see the categories they use and the descriptions for the guide the information around bilateral, multilateral aid spending. So it's much easier to align your information, see what your funding is doing in relation to others.
So there have been a couple of mentions of the intergovernmental organizations. I think it's important to point out that the World Bank, UNDP, OECD have all decided to make their data on development very much available. So this opportunity to capture a huge amount of knowledge is there, remains there. Larry, talk a little bit about situations where data are ignored, and I'm thinking about matters of public policy. Hewlett Foundation has tried to influence public policy when it comes to climate change. Others have tried to influence public policy when it comes to gun control. Those are two examples where data are not carrying the day, right? Or at least in the case of climate change, data are being ignored. In the case of gun control, we're actually choosing not to gather some data. How does that affect a foundation strategy when data don't carry the day?
No, well, you mean the data, you mean government's refusal to use data in order to make policy. So, yeah. I mean, it gets to a different problem, right? Which is, or as difficult sometimes is, sometimes the way government uses data is either primitive or not very thoughtful. So, from our perspective, in some sense, that underlies everything we do, right? So certainly the larger foundations and the foundations that are working on policy rather than direct services, the whole point is to leverage your assets by getting government to enact policies that make sense. And in a sort of ideal world, you can develop the evidence, you can develop the practices, and that will get picked up by a rational process and implemented into policy. So, when there's a breakdown in the political system such that people don't care about that, then that itself becomes something that you need to address. So there are fixes, although they're complicated and long-term, to the political system itself. And that is something, that we and I think a number of other foundations are beginning to look into. So you must correct that, right? At the same time, it is interesting how much work can be done, I think, even within the current kind of messed up political system at the state and local level at least, to get government to use data better, because a lot of it is simply a lot of the people who are in office haven't done it in the past. They're open to being educated about it and are actually willing and eager. The Obama administration has pushed a lot of this too, willing and eager to understand how to use the data better. Mm-hmm. And so that's a kind of work I think that can also be done.
Mm-hmm. Can I say, James, as you mentioned Brazil, I have to quote, there was a Brazilian author, Monteiro Lobato, who wrote children's books. He also is a member of the Communist Party and wrote children's books, so imagine that. But he said something which I think really applies to data. He was talking about books. He said that books don't change the world, people change the world, books change people. So I think data without messengers, data without messaging, and data without delivery mechanisms is not enough to produce change. So.
But it's worth remembering, and we're living in this peculiar age where people they map the way they want to read the data or what data they will look at based on their preconceptions to. I mean, climate is the best example of that. I have constant ongoing conversations with my conservative friends, and there is always enough ambiguity in what's out there that if you're determined to reach the conclusion before you hear it, you can do that. And I mean, one of the really interesting developments is for those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, the right was relentlessly critical of the left-wing critique of objectivity, which they have now fully embraced. Right, so there is no objectivity. There is what you're ideologically predisposed to, and then you can pick and choose among the data. So that is something that needs to be fought quite separately, because it does not, as you can see in the case of climate or guns, it does not matter in effect how good the data is. Now, I think fortunately not all issues have quite that high political salience, but it does bleed all the way down on almost everything these days.
I mean, we do have a sense that we've become so polarized, right, that we just forfeited our ability to solve any large problems together. How are you thinking about going after this problem?
Well, the polarization, the public at large is a lot less polarized than the political system is, although it is increasingly so, and that's because, of course, there is a way in which people follow political leadership. So, I mean, this is a long conversation, but we have, I think, in this country in particular, stumbled over a 40 or 50-year period into a set of institutional arrangements that reinforce that, right? And so, I think what we need to do simultaneously is push again some cultural messages about the need for compromise within a democratic society, the need for open-mindedness in approaching what makes sense and doesn't make sense, the need for pragmatism in policy, while dealing with a set of institutional issues. And I think you all know about the money in politics, gerrymandering, primary elections, rules in Congress, voter registration, voter access, and so on. And just we need to be working simultaneously across all those fronts. That's a slow process. It will take a long time, I think, to restore that sense, because undoing those institutions without getting the public at large mobilized won't have an effect, right? And mobilizing the public without fixing the institutions is almost impossible. So you need to kind of simultaneously move everything along. And so it's a difficult process. It is one, though, that I think everybody shares an equal interest in.
Yeah.
It is worse in the US than most of the rest of the world, but people do seem to be trying hard to catch us.
I think it's another issue where vocabulary and data can really help, because if you can sort of figure out what the vocabulary is to describe the issue you're approaching on, I will guarantee you that you will find more philanthropists, individual philanthropists, more foundations out there doing some aspect of this work than you ever imagined. And I think that helps legitimize it, and it does a really important thing. I think it's a preventative or prophylactic mechanism from overly politicizing philanthropy. Virtually any cause, there are many, many foundations out there. You have company, you're not alone, and it's really important. But part of it is defining exactly what the issue is.
Yeah, though there's a difference. I think that's true. In fact, we're finding that we're starting to try and develop some sort of mapping for who's doing work in the democracy space, and it turns out to be incredibly broad. The complex data issue is the next one, though, right? Yeah. Which is both getting some agreement on what works and what doesn't when there's really complicated data on that, and getting people to try different things and cooperate. Yeah. So, you discover there's many people doing it in different ways, and they're each kind of fixed on the way that they're doing it. And knowing that others are doing it doesn't itself seem to bring people around to saying, okay, let's try something a little different. If we can work with you on this, we'll each do it a little differently than we've been doing it. And that, I guess I'd say, I'm not quite sure I understand why that's so difficult in this sector, but it is quite difficult.
Yeah, I think I call it the transaction costs of collaboration among foundations are very high, partly because of the vocabulary issue, but also partly within the large staffed foundations, knowledge management is still very much in its infancy. So you will find often within a large foundation that there may be 3 or 4 different application forms in use, that different programs won't agree necessarily on the vocabulary they use to describe the programs across the foundation. So just getting that information within your own foundation. I mean, when I've worked in large foundations and small foundations. In a large foundation, I learned very quickly never to say that our foundation has never funded X, because sure enough, it had been funded, and it took the grantees about 5 seconds to figure that out and discover that. What about this grant or something? So, but you can imagine if it's difficult within a foundation to manage your own knowledge, when you're trying to collaborate with others, the transaction cost becomes very, very high. And I think more and more foundations, I know Rockefeller Foundation has recently hired a vice president specifically for knowledge management. There's a lot going on in this space. I think grants management programs are becoming more and more workspaces that pull in data that's necessary for decision making. It could be GuideStar data, it could be our data, it could be Google data, it could be Salesforce data. Because it's also not reasonable to expect people at foundations whose basic job is to allocate resources to make positive change in the world to go chase, in 10 different sources for the information they need.
Mm-hmm. So let's just step back for a minute and think about the various audiences for foundations. I mean, there is one another, but I suspect that is the last audience, and that's why the collaboration is so hard. They're the grant seekers, and when you're thinking about what you put on your website, and so those are the folks you want to be helping, right? To help them understand the various programs and what they should be applying for, if they should be applying. But there are emerging donors as well, who are very, very hungry for information, mostly on impact, on what strategies work, what strategies don't. And they're not asking about individual grantees. There's no risk of exposing an individual grantee. They want to know about the strategy that you adopted as a foundation and what you thought of that strategy 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. Is that do you think about that audience and think about what needs they might have in that regard?
So we think about that a lot. As I say, I think it's, and again, there's the cost-benefit analysis, which is mostly about the timing. So when is the right time to do the kind of evaluation that you're going to then want to put out there for everybody else to learn from?
Right.
Midstream, at the end, do you want to do it at the end of every program or not? Which ones are worth it and which ones aren't? But I think that's critical, right? Mm-hmm. So again, we always want to be thinking sector-wide. It's not just about what we're accomplishing, but about what we as a sector accomplish. Mm-hmm. And the only way you're going to improve that is by sharing what you're learning as you go along, absolutely.
Right. And I want to also turn, Brad, back to your sort of transactional data that you described that doesn't sound that interesting to us because we have access to it, right? We've got GuideStar, we've got so much access. But I think about China, for example, where perhaps the biggest problem when it comes to philanthropy is the pervasive lack of trust. Trust that a ganzhou, a government-approved grantee will, where will the money go? Is that concern a truly independent grantee? Will they really have the capacity to live up to their mission? And there's a situation where they've replicated, or they're in the process of replicating, the Foundation Center, which is to me, a very significant step because it begins the process of shedding light on these organizations and allowing folks who are donors to stop holding the money at the sidelines. Say something about the progress made and whether you're trying this anywhere else. Yeah,
the irony of that story is about, I guess it was almost 4 years ago, a Chinese delegation came and visited the Foundation Center and said that they were thinking of creating a Foundation Center in China. And we told them the origin story of the Foundation Center here, which a lot of people know actually. Most people know, as Chris Stone, the president of Open Society Foundation, said, most people know the Foundation Center as the place that foundations send you when they don't want to give you a grant, which is true because you find somebody else to give you a grant. But the Foundation Center was actually created during McCarthyism. It was created in 1956, following two sets of hearings in 1952 and 1955 when foundations were being were being investigated for support of un-American activities. So it was really sort of ironic and interesting to tell a Chinese delegation that this was created because foundations were alleged to be supporting communism. And what they were interested in doing, precisely at a time when China was beginning to realize that its social safety net was tattering, that income, because of the accelerated economic growth, that disparities in income distribution were growing, that there was a set of policies put in place to redirect money from the extremely wealthy back into the social sectors of the economy through the creation of public charities and foundations. And a group of people felt it was really important to have an independent, as possible within China, information system about this emerging sector. So they basically wanted to replicate a lot of the data collection capabilities and research and reporting formats of the Foundation Center. And it was a fantastic opportunity. We made a decision basically to open up all the intellectual property of the Foundation Center. And all that we asked in return were two things. One was that they provided a stream of data to us on philanthropy in China, which is really interesting to the rest of the world. And the other thing is they originally wanted to license our technology platform, and we said, don't be crazy. We started in 1956. We have stuff that, the Smithsonian would even reject. So we said, actually, we'd like access to your technology because you're going to see a lot of what we do, and you're going to reinvent it with new technology. So that was sort of the agreement. And it's really remarkable what they've been able to do in a very short period of time, including they created recently. It's really worth looking at. Go to foundationcenter.org.cn, okay, because that's the China suffix, and look up on the English part of their site, the Foundation Transparency Index. They have created an index with 50 variables in it, in which they rate and score Chinese foundations on a weekly basis in terms of their transparency. And I can imagine doing that in the US, but it's kind of amazing they've been able to do it in China.
So while we're on McCarthyism, let me just go back a few thoughts. We've been talking mostly about the kind of data that is generated by the social sector, by foundations and by those they support. But what about the data that is gathered on the sector by the U.S. government, for example, not for political reasons, but employment data, back to that sort of transactional stuff.
Well,
I know that we've at Aspen Institute have been working with you. We've been working with GuideStar and others, and there's Darren, and even better, there's Jacob, and so it's been the Mott Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Gates Foundation. Hewlett have helped.
And as Jane would know from one of her other roles with Aspen, there's been a big movement forward in this. There's always been a sense that the 990 data, the 990 being the tax return filed by nonprofits, and the 990 PF being the version of that filed by private foundations, should be made available by the Internal Revenue Service as open data in digital form. Heretofore, it's been made available to the public upon request, but in a kind of archaic way. I mean, there's been no digital filing requirement. So even if a foundation or a nonprofit did digitally file their tax return, the Internal Revenue Service would essentially take a picture of it and convert it into something called a TIFF file, which is an image file, and then provide it to organizations like GuideStar and the Foundation Center and the Urban Institute and others. And we had to take these and turn them into PDFs and had people then manually key in the information. So even something that was born digital was processed by the government as an image file and then had to be manually keyed in. Now, there's reasons for that, but I won't go into that. But in the new, as I understand it, in the new budget put forward by the administration, the IRS and the Treasury are saying that all 990s, private foundations, nonprofits alike in this country should be filed in digital form. And the IRS is required to make it available, all of the information available as open, digitized data in a timely fashion. Now, the devil's in the details and how that gets done and what timely means and all those things. But we are much, much closer than we've ever been to having all of this be open data in the same way the patent office's data is open and the White House visitors list is open and all these incredible pieces of open data.
Right. And I should note that Darren McKeever will be leading a session with Jacob and others on the whole question of building a knowledge commons for the sector, including this kind of data. Like, I wanted to take you back, though, to sort of your first days on the job, coming into the Hewlett Foundation. It wasn't that far away geographically from where you'd been, but it was very, very far away in so many other ways. It sounds like you were surprised by attitudes towards risk in the sector broadly. I'm not talking about Hewlett in particular. What else came as a surprise?
It's been sort of surprises every day. But one of the other, so I came out of the university, and one of the things that was attractive about this sector is it's an intellectual endeavor very much like it, except practical. You get to do things, and yet there is a surprising degree of insularity between the philanthropy world and the academic world. I've actually been really surprised in there's a ton of academic work going on, actually, data galore on all sorts of the problems. And instead, not just us, but foundations generally go out and they hire others to redo a lot of that research, invariably less well, I should say. There's not much intellectual exchange. We did a conference early on looking at the democracy issues on polarization, and people were surprised at a lot that the academics had to say, even though it's actually conventional wisdom within the academic world already. And that's just because there's not the kind of interchange that there ought to be. So there are, here we're talking about information and data on the substantive work we do, not on what we're doing, but on, and there's just a large world out there that is not as connected as it ought to be. That was, for me, in some ways, the biggest surprise. And then the other thing that has been surprising is, and this ties back to some of the earlier stuff, we're an intensely process-oriented profession. So, the first thing you learn as a lawyer is process serves substance. I mean, that's the only point of it. And it's not an end in and of itself. And if it becomes an obstruction to the ends, then you have to change or scale back the process. And again, this is sector-wide, and it's in our foundation as well. And I think I understand some of the reasons for it, but it still is, to me, an ongoing surprise how much process you have to go through to do things. Even, you know what you're going to do, or where this is supposed to end up, and there's an immense amount of sort of stuff that needs to get done.
I'll say that I've been in the job 4.5 years, but I had a big surprise when I came into the current job. I'd worked in foundations either as a grant maker or hiring grant makers and supervising grant makers for a very long period of time. And within the first few weeks when I came into the Foundation Center, I started to write a blog piece. I have it halfway written still, called I Repent. And it was not the usual thing you hear about people that go from foundations into nonprofits about grant making decision. It was just about all the time that I spent as a grant maker without ever making use of any of the information that was available about who was funding what where. And there's just this is an industry with unlimited potential, with something incredibly valuable, which are resources which are not earmarked or not tied down and are really free to take risks. But there's just an enormous amount of inefficiency because of this inability to really stop and see who does what where, which is a very basic level. It's way downstream from impact, or way upstream.
But all these things are connected, right? To me, they're all connected. So, I mean, the third surprise, I love this. It has been an amazing experience, because just like everybody here, I'm sure, I haven't gotten to know most of you yet, but you encounter people, we were talking about this earlier, who, they're smart and they're passionate and they're knowledgeable and they care about what they're doing, and it's like we're getting in our own way in a whole bunch of ways. So it's sort of, how can we just simplify this? And to me, it all does tie back to at least on the grant making side, to the risk side, because, having been a fundraiser at the law school, and people came in, and there's this line everybody has to say, it's so much harder to give money away than it is to ask for it, which is true, I should say. But, the reason is because you're so afraid to not make the maximally efficient use of the dollars that you have. And on some level you want to go, actually at some point that itself is becoming counterproductive. So whether it's, I had a recent thing where somebody was going to spend $2.5 million to do a randomized controlled trial to prove for sure that something was going to happen. And I said, $2.5 million, I mean, are you sure that what you're going to get out of the randomized control trial relative to what you would get out of the unrandomized just data that you could gather is worth the $2.5 million that you could instead put back into the grant? And again, there's no way to think about that, but they were so, focused on wanting the absolute best evidence so that they could say for sure that they knew what they were doing. And as I say, I think it ties back to this, got to make sure that we don't, make the best conceivable use of the resources that we have.
Risk. This is a wonderful way both to start and end this conversation. I really want to thank you, Larry, so much. This is such a refreshing conversation. Brad, thank you. We're all going off to our working groups, and this ought to really fill our conversation. So join me in thanking Larry and Brad.